When I use a word, Humpty Dumpty said, in a rather scornful tone, it means just what I choose it to mean, neither more nor less. The question is, said Alice, whether you can make words mean so many different things. The question is, said Humpty Dumpty, which is to be master. That is all.
Shuma alaf awilim na kapima, kima na kapu babtashu usheti shuma, karnishu la
סקול יסכל השור ולא יאכל את בשרו, ובעל השור נקי. ואם שור נגח ומתמול שלשון והוא אגיב עליו, ולא ישמע.
Quod conebite fuerit, aperi et nudius tertius, et contesti sunt dominum eius, et conclusite
But that he hath killed a man or woman. The ox shall be stoned, and his owner also shall be put to death. If there be laid on him
shall
some
be
money,
stoned, and its owner also shall be put to death. If a ransom is imposed on the owner, then the owner shall pay whatever is
ונתן פדיון נפשו בכל אשר נמשת עליו.
Imagine telling Henry Kissinger that he'd be remembered 4,000 years from now. But the only thing anybody would know about him was that he was an honorary member of the Harlem Globetrotters. That's probably how Hammurabi would feel, knowing he's remembered for his law code. It was a thing he did, but by no means the main thing. It's something to keep in mind when thinking about the ancient world. They did not know what we would be reading of theirs. What of our world will still be studied 4,000 years from now? John Rawls? Jordan Peterson? The lyrics of a Rihanna song? Perhaps something you've never even heard of. Or perhaps nothing. Perhaps every record of us will be lost. So it is for the Babylonians. We've already seen Babylon in the last episode. Hammurabi had an impressive 42-year reign there as king a couple of generations earlier than Ipecaia. He came to the throne. When he did, it wasn't a great power, but one city-state amongst many. Amanda Padami describes him as follows, quote, "He busied himself with the usual concerns of the leader of a smallish kingdom, appeasing the gods, digging canals, restoring city walls, and so on. He married and had children. He wrote letters and sent his diplomats to negotiate with allies." End quote. After 30 years of this, he won a series of expansionist wars, carving out an empire for himself. His letters, many of which survive, show him to be a careful manager, closely overseeing administration, enforcing a highly complex system of property holdings, collecting taxes, and acting as the final appeal in disputes. He was, in this sense, a lawgiver, something like a one-person Supreme Court. Was all of this done with reference to his law code? Not really. The code isn't really law as we would think about it. After a preamble, it's just a series of judgments, mostly in a if X, then Y format. So here's a simple one. If a man steals from a temple, then he is to be executed. Codes like this were a common genre of writing, and Hammurabi wasn't the first or the last to make one. Many ancient Near Eastern rulers had their own equivalent. The code itself was written on a beautiful 7-foot-tall basalt stele, think like a sort of almost like a small obelisk, topped with an image of the king receiving it from the sun god Shamash. There would be lots of these, and they'd be placed in busy public places in Babylon. It's a political billboard, essentially. A wordy billboard. One might wonder if something more pithy might have been more effective. It's like a meme by an internet Marxist, one small image and a wall of text. While we shouldn't assume that the code is exactly how the law was applied, it does give a sense of what was important to the ancient Babylonians, just by what it spends its time discussing. So, it starts with a bunch of laws on perjury and theft, for instance, which makes sense. Every society is concerned with that. There's then a big section on agriculture. So, for instance, there's a law on what to do if your ox gores and kills someone. That, it turns out, is not your fault. What about, though, if the ox has done it before, if it's already gored someone? If it's wait for it, a repeat ox fender. Yeah, okay, fine. Well, then that's different. If it's a repeat ox fender, then you have to pay a fine, quite a big fine, less if it kills a slave. Here's how that law sounded in the original ancient Akkadian.
Shuma alap awilim na kapima, kima na kapu babtashu ushedishuma, karnishu la usharim, alpam la usanikma, alpumshu marawilim ekipma ushtamit, mishil manakaspam inadin.
This focus on the real specifics of agricultural management down to these, niche scenarios makes sense. This is a society based on the farmland created by all those canals. There's then a chunk of laws on merchants. This is an interconnected world with advanced trade systems. A few on selling alcohol. The ancient Mesopotamians liked their beer, and every society that likes their beer feels the need to have rules to regulate that for obvious enough reasons. There's then some more on property, and then we get into the family laws, and these are going to be quite alien to us. They start with a big series of laws about incest. Hammurabi would have had something to say about Ted Cruz's taste in online videos. And okay, sure, no incest, but why is this such a big thing? I think what this is about is inheritance. Who gets the estate when the patriarch dies was a huge concern. So they wanted to avoid contested paternity or situations where a family structure is messed up that incest could create. There's then a chunk of marriage laws. Now, their marriage isn't the same as our marriage. Words can and have meant different things. And as John Stuart Mill tells us, one of the biggest mistakes in looking at history is assuming that the same word has always stood for the same aggregation of ideas. For us, marriage was, at least traditionally, one man and one woman. Adultery, anything outside of that. So we assume that that's what they meant. But it isn't. The law is specifically addressed to men. When it says you, it means a man. The idea of the marriage laws and the adultery prohibitions is something like this. You, a man, can't have sex with another man's wife. By implication, a woman can't have sex with any man except her husband. The motivation here is exactly the same as for the incest laws. You, a man, want to know that your children are yours. You want to know that they can inherit in your lineage. Now here's what the law doesn't say, though. It doesn't say that you, a man, can't have sex outside of marriage. You absolutely can, just not with another man's property, i.e. with his wife or unwed virgin daughter. And if that feels an uncomfortable way of talking about it, that is kind of my point. But visiting prostitutes or seeking out other forms of casual sex are nowhere prohibited and were accepted as completely normal. Nor is having multiple wives an issue. The code regulates, but allows this. What about having sex with another man, married or otherwise? Well, that doesn't affect paternity or inheritance. It doesn't impact another man's property claims. So there's no problem. No ancient Near Eastern law code until the Bible has any prohibition on male homosexuality. There are laws against homosexual rape and homosexual incest in other codes, but just having sex was completely acceptable. Apparently, Hammurabi himself did. He had multiple wives, but also had male lovers, a fact that the wife of a fellow king mentioned in a letter, as if it were no big deal. Which it probably wasn't. It wasn't considered the equal of heterosexuality. There was no such thing as gay marriage, for instance. Marriage, as we've seen, was just too tied up in producing legitimate children. That was its function. But just having sex with other men wasn't a problem either. What about women? You, a man, can't have sex with another man's wife. Can a woman have sex with a woman, married or otherwise? You'd assume not, right? Given the deeply patriarchal nature of the society and the unequal constraints it put on women. But that's not what the texts say. It's not what any of them say. No ancient Near Eastern law code, including the biblical law codes, have anything to say on female homosexuality. When we talk about the Bible and homosexuality, we're talking about male homosexuality. Always. We'll return to this in a later episode. Now, another big inequality reflected in the code is slavery. In the context of the marriage laws, it's taken for granted that a man can keep female slaves for sexual and reproductive purposes. This also is not considered adultery. High-status women could also own slaves, and it seems there was a common practice, of which we have laws referencing, of wives gifting enslaved women to their husbands. Quote, "Take my slave and have children with her." Essentially outsourcing sexual and reproductive labour onto enslaved women. Hang on, this sounds familiar? Yep, there's a very similar practice described in the Bible, and those passages became the inspiration for Margaret Atwood's The Handmaid's Tale. It's the epigraph to the book. It's one of those Bible verses. Now, this feels off somehow to us, apart from the obvious ethical implications, because it's very different to US antebellum slavery, the type of slavery most familiar to us, in which high-status white women would force slaves to breastfeed their children, but they couldn't outsource having them. Enslavers in America would rape enslaved women, but the children from that would be slaves, not heirs to the estate. Thomas Jefferson's children with Sally Hemings required him to free them. It was universally accepted that they were born as slaves. In contrast, in the Israelite family tree, many of the 12 sons of Jacob were born to enslaved women, given to the patriarch by one of his wives. Exactly the same practice we just saw from ancient Babylon. Nowhere in these stories did they have to free those children. They were theirs, born in their lineage, with their social and legal status. Why the difference? First, racism. Slavery in the US was bound up in a racial caste system, but for the ancients it wasn't. People of all sorts of different races enslaved other people of all sorts of different races, including their own. Second, heritability. In the US South, slavery was passed through the generations following a Roman law system. In this, inheritance in general is patrilineal. Family names and status come from the father, except for slave status, which is matrilineal. That runs through the female line, patra sequitur ventrum, or following the womb. When the two conflict, the matrilineal principle always wins out. Put simply, if the father's surname is Smith, the children's surname is Smith. They're his. His name overrides the mother's. His lineage overrides hers. Unless the mother is a slave, and then the child is a slave. Always. that overrides his lineage. In the ancient Near East, inheritance was also patrilineal in general, and the child of slaves would also be a slave. But the children of a free parent and a slave were always born free, regardless of gender. If of a free father and acknowledged, they were legitimate heirs and could inherit. Now, because we're historically downstream of a Roman-style slave system, its rules are encoded in our head, usually subconsciously. We ask, why didn't Jefferson free Hemming's children? Note the assumptions that they are her children and born into her caste. A Babylonian would be baffled. They would ask, why is a powerful patriarch enslaving his own children? Words mean different things. Their slavery is not our slavery. These differences make a difference. How these different types of slavery work is going to be critical for understanding the Bible. It's why I'm starting with it. To be clear, though, none of these different types of slavery are good. People will sometimes excuse ancient slavery, particularly biblical slavery, where they want to apologise for the Bible, on the grounds that it wasn't racially based, or that the types of work that slaves did was different, and that's true enough. But you might also ask how much consent an enslaved woman had in being given to her enslaver's husband, having sex with him, having his children. It's probably safe to assume none whatsoever. Well, hang on though, isn't that a bit moralistic? Is it our role to judge people that long ago according to our standards, according to our morality? So, I think that's complicated. I think, to start with, yes, our morality is different. Words mean different things. Our normative concepts and categories are not those of the ancients, and we should try to understand those differences critically and carefully. But I don't think that requires us to be totally neutral, to assume that they're both equal, that there's never a case where modern morality is better, or, conversely, that there's never a case where the ancients might be onto something morally that we ignore. And nor do I think a careful, nuanced reading requires us to turn off our moral emotions. When we read, for instance, in Deuteronomy that, on conquering a town, we should kill all the men and older women, but, quote, keep for ourselves the younger girls, when we hear that, we feel a bit of a jolt, and I think it's appropriate that we do so. Now, I think history shouldn't stop there, simply stringing together a series of jolts as a debunking exercise, as a certain type of Chomsky or Zinn-inspired writing can often do. I think that Deuteronomy passage should shock us, not least because it's in a holy book, but I also want to put that command in context, to have a three-dimensional view of the assumptions that go into it, to understand, for instance, why some societies specifically targeted young girls for enslavement, and others targeted adult men. And it's not all bad, as I said. There's this grand historical narrative that this age, the pre-biblical age, was purely defined by hierarchy and despotism, before a, quote, axial age, in which the Hebrew prophets, the Mahavira and the Buddha came along and said, "Oh, gee, shouldn't we be nicer to each other? What about equality? What about the poor?" And I cannot emphasize enough just how wrong that story is. The Hebrew Bible works within the ancient Near Eastern framework on slavery and gender, and what we celebrate today as the good stuff often has more ancient antecedents. Hammurabi's code is very brutal at times. These are not liberal societies in any way, shape or form. But it also expresses a concern for the poor and the oppressed. That, quote, "the mighty might not exploit the weak, that the orphan and the widow may be treated properly," end quote. He describes himself as the shepherd who brings peace, with a staff that is straight. It sounds very Bible-y at points, which isn't a coincidence. Like Atrahasis, this is a literary ancestor of some of the biblical texts. You remember the repeat ox fender? He's in the Bible. We get basically the exact same law in the Covenant Code, an old series of laws in Exodus 21, 29 through 31 to be exact. Here it is in the original biblical Hebrew.
וכי ייקח שור את איש או את אישה ומת, שקו יסקל השור ולא יאכל את בשרו, ובעל השור נקי. ואם שור נגח ומתמול שלשום והועד בבעליו ולא ישמרנו, והמית איש או אישה, השור יסקל וגם בעליו יומת. אם כופר יושת עליו, ונתן פדיון נפשו ככל אשר יושת עליו.
That's what my intro is. You might have recognised those two original language excerpts. It's the linguistic evolution of one law, the law of the goring ox, it's called, through the ages, through 4,000 years of translations, at least the very main ones in the Western tradition. I chose it because there's a fair case to be made. It's the oldest Bible verse. And I just think it's really interesting to think about the deep lineage of texts like that. Or to give another example, I was at a protest recently and I saw someone dressed in the Handmaid's Tale outfit, the white bonnet and the red cloak. That is a reference to a piece of media, the literary descendants of which you can trace a genealogy of that back 2,000 years before the birth of Christ. I think that's just so interesting. Now, in stressing continuity, this isn't to say that the Bible was just a carbon copy of these older texts. Context doesn't mean total conformity. There was innovation as well, of course. Creation epics, flood stories, and law codes were established genres. But just like our genres today, people took them in different directions. And sometimes, just sometimes, there was really radical change. There was wild, what the absolute hell is this guy talking about innovation. This isn't all just slow evolution. Sometimes people got very out-of-the-box ideas in their heads. And every so often, those people got power. We'll get to that next time.